Good afternoon, St. James Church. I've been looking forward to this occasion, and I thank David and Cordelia for inviting me to present today. And I want to congratulate all of you on your sustained witness for 275 years. That is really something. My subject today is William Augustus Muhlenberg, who served St. James Church as co-rector from December 1st, 1820 through the end of June 1826. Muhlenberg's first cure was Lancaster. It's where he cut his teeth as a priest of the church and grew as a human being in countless and, I'm sure, untold ways. He became one of the greatest clergymen in the history of the Episcopal Church, right here in Lancaster. When Muhlenberg was born in 1796, his hometown of Philadelphia was thriving and showing the way in government, scientific advance, commerce, industry, banking, and religion. Ample resources in this big city complemented 15 feet of topsoil in the hinterland. There was great cooperation coming down the Schuylkill, coming down the Delaware, between Philadelphia as a port and the interior. This is a view looking east down Market Street in Philadelphia in 1799. That's the First City Troop in the foreground. This is another picture of Market Street in Philadelphia. This time you're looking west. The occasion is Washington's funeral procession in 1799, only 3 years after Muhlenberg was born. Muhlenberg grew up close to the government in Philadelphia. This is Independence Hall, depicted in 1796. William's grandfather was Frederick Augustus Conrad Muhlenberg, Speaker of the Continental Congresses and first Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. The Muhlenbergs were prolific and influential. The patriarch of the American family established the Lutheran Church in this country. William's great uncle Peter was a war hero. He rose in Washington's esteem to the rank of Major General during the Revolution. He was also a Lutheran pastor, which makes him a very colorful person to look at in history. The family as a whole, I think, was faithful, patriotic, dutiful, and aimed to do good in the new republic. This is Frederick Muhlenberg, first Speaker of the House of Representatives. This is William Muhlenberg's mother, Mary Catherine Sheaf Muhlenberg. I know the reproduction is poor, but the face is still revealing, isn't it? The image bespeaks to me of refinement and gentility, of intelligence, wit, as well as sensitivity, and a little bit of melancholy. Mary's father, William Sheaf, built up one of the most successful wine merchant enterprises in the United States. He was a go-to merchant for presidents and senators and many other people, all up and down the East Coast. Mary's brother, George Sheaf, who married her Muhlenberg sister-in-law, only added to the family wealth. I think you recognize Christ Church, Philadelphia. Though he hailed from the great Lutheran family, William decided at the age of 8 to become an Episcopalian. The reason is simple. He wanted to praise God in English instead of German. So he did worship at Christ Church and St. Peter's and St. James and other parishes in the city of Philadelphia. The boy was drawn in to the Anglican ethos, the prayer book, the religion at once traditional and open to new ideas. He loved it. He cared about it. He wanted it to flourish. He gave all that he was and all that he had to the success of the Episcopal Church, and this was true throughout his life. Bishop William White saw tremendous promise in William Muhlenberg. The bishop gave him a superlative model of the gentleman priest, of the cleric who must serve a flock of untidy differences and disagreements, of often competing ideas about God, humankind, and the universe. For that is the way Philadelphia was and the Diocese of Pennsylvania in this time. William White carried it off with love, aplomb, and irrefutable justice. He was much loved and was a very, very interesting person. Muhlenberg grew to be a lot like him. Muhlenberg was a fine student at the Philadelphia Academy and then at the Grammar School of the University of Pennsylvania. He graduated summa cum laude from Penn in 1814. He was only 18 years old. This image is of Penn's second campus, in use from 1801 to 1829. William Muhlenberg became a very competent classic and continued in the belief that a liberal education should not dispense with serious work in Latin and Greek. And of course, he believed that it must not be separated from religious faith. This is Jackson Kemper, later the first missionary bishop of the Episcopal Church. He was 7 years older than Muhlenberg. He grew up in New York. He was prepared at the Cheshire Academy in Connecticut and graduated valedictorian of his class at Columbia. Bishop White brought Kemper to Philadelphia for various reasons, but one of the things he did when he got to Philadelphia was to prepare Muhlenberg for ordination. It was an excellent and fateful choice. Excellent because Kemper was already a learned divine who was utterly dedicated to what he and Muhlenberg called the ministry of reconciliation out in the real world, meaning possibly the American frontier. It was a fateful appointment by Bishop White because Kemper was both a high churchman and a person of deep evangelical zeal, and he was bent on reforming the Episcopal Church. He had a lasting effect on Muhlenberg. Dr. Moyes sent me this splendid drawing of Lancaster in 1800. It was the second largest city in Pennsylvania, and it was a happening place. And St. James Church was right down in the middle of the prosperity and the fast pace and the happiness. Here's another image of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Notice the Conestoga wagon. This is Henry Muhlenberg, William's great uncle, who was pastor of Holy Trinity Lutheran for 35 years and served as president of Franklin College from its founding in 1787 until his death in 1815. This Dr. Muhlenberg was a world-renowned botanist. And so I've got this image up here because he epitomized the philosophy of his great nephew, that the most serious academic learning and the Christian faith can and must go together. I also added this photograph to show that William Muhlenberg was not a stranger to Lancaster. He had family connections, and in fact, his grandfather, Frederick, moved here and died here in 1801. This is a photograph of the parish church from winter 1865. I've wondered what's in that barrel, wine or beer. But it's still the way the church looked, the way Muhlenberg found it in 1820. It's the second church of St. James. It has the classic Lancaster look, doesn't it? And reminds us of other handsome buildings from that era. Muhlenberg was ordained to the diaconate in 1817 and to the priesthood on October 22nd, 1820. He was with Bishop White in Lancaster to consecrate this new church on October 15th, 1820. Joseph Clarkson was the rector of St. James, who took on William Muhlenberg in December 1820. Clarkson was rector from 1799 to 1830. Long tenures in parishes were not uncommon in that day, but remember that Lancaster was a fast-paced protean phenomenon, and St. James was a fashionable, smart church filled with upwardly mobile and wealthy city leaders. 30 years a rector in a place like that is indeed an accomplishment. When Muhlenberg got to St. James Church, Judge Robert Coleman was the warden. Coleman was a self-made man of uncommon ability, entrepreneurial genius, and enormous wealth accrued in the iron forging and founding businesses. He was a dedicated parish leader and a good Christian. He who would have had much to teach William Muhlenberg about how to address a complicated situation with new, innovative ideas did not get the chance. Such a learning experience was cut short when Muhlenberg pushed in 1822-23 for a Sunday evening service. The two very strong wills collided on this matter. The parish was split over it, the vestry divided. Judge Coleman expected to prevail, but did not. Muhlenberg went ahead with the innovation, which proved to be a pretty decent idea. The judge resigned. For this, and surely other reasons, the judge assured the young priest that he was not welcome to court his daughter, Sarah Hand Coleman. Both young hearts were broken, but the father's will was adamant, even beyond his grave. He died in August 1825 at the age of 77. Before passing on from this slide, let me just submit that this great and surprising antagonism with Judge Coleman was a lifelong lesson learned by Muhlenberg. If you really want to be a reformer, then you must expect to attract criticism and antagonists. You must grow a tough skin and expect plenty of trouble along the way. You must even assume that you will at times have to give up the things you love. In 1821, Muhlenberg reorganized the parish Sunday school at St. James. This picture of a contemporary school prompts me to say that Muhlenberg's idea of a Sunday school was somewhat novel and very ambitious. His Sunday school at Lancaster was more like a combination system of youth ministry, systematic learning, and the ways and means of the Boy Scouts of America. There was no sitting around in the new Sunday school at Lancaster. In any case, Muhlenberg was not going to have anything like this at St. James, Lancaster. The course was invigorating and meaningful. Pupils memorized scripture, creeds, catechism, and collects. They attended worship with their teachers every Sunday. Tickets were frequently awarded for achievements in the sacred studies. 10 blue tickets were redeemable for 1 red ticket, and the red tickets evidently had real buying power for these boys and girls. Already Muhlenberg was showing a keen knowledge of what Thomas Arnold called boy nature, and he honored the girls by treating them the same as the boys, by and large. This was a new attitude. Muhlenberg expected real commitment on the part of the teachers. He trained them and nurtured them in small groups. He wanted them to be leaders. He expected them to follow the progress of their charges even through the days of the week, so they got to know them. The St. James Sunday School became a popular thing to do among parents and children. According to Klein and Diller, who wrote the history of the parish, enrollment went from about 50 in 1821 to almost 300 by 1827. This Sunday school was a veritable model of its kind. In 1822, Muhlenberg founded the Public School of Lancaster. Through his influence in the legislature, it became the second public school district in Pennsylvania. Muhlenberg had been a director of the first district in Philadelphia at a very young age. He was a director in Lancaster, but was the de facto superintendent. Take a close look at this photograph, please. Children are being instructed by children. That's the Lancastrian or monitorial system Muhlenberg implemented. The forms, or benches, in the middle of the building were used, but only at carefully prescribed times during the course of a rather long school day. Here's a closer view of that monitorial method developed by Joseph Lancaster in the late 1780s. He based his method on what he heard of Andrew Bell, an Anglican missionary in India who was very successful teaching young children literacy in this manner. If you Google monitorial system, there's good information available. The fundamental principle really is that one learns by teaching. Lancaster's motto was Qui docet discit, who teaches learns, which he borrowed from Seneca. Muhlenberg altered the Lancastrian method by selecting older pupils as the monitors, calling them tutors, mentoring them in small groups, and training them as teachers. He expected these tutors to set the tone of the school, head off difficult students at the pass, and to actually teach new knowledge and skills to good effect. The Bell-Lancastrian system has one obvious advantage, which is budgetary. Fewer professional teachers means fewer people on the payroll. Both Lancaster and Bell believed that this method was the Christian way to educate. They did have critics. In 1823, Muhlenberg raised today's equivalent of $260,000 for the new public school building. There was room for 600 students. It was on the southeast corner of West Chestnut and Prince Streets, and stood on that spot until after the turn of the 20th century, when it was raised to make room for the new post office. This is John Barrett Kerfoot, a boy in Muhlenberg's public school, and I think a parishioner as well. You'll know the name because, as a young scholar, it was he who addressed the Marquis de Lafayette when that superstar visited Lancaster in 1825. Kerfoot became Dr. Muhlenberg's right-hand man at the schools on Long Island. In 1842, his dear school father sent him to Washington County, Maryland, where he founded St. James School, the second school in the National Church School movement. Kerfoot was elected the first bishop of Pittsburgh in 1867, and in 1868 he was awarded an honorary doctorate from Cambridge University. He was, in the North Atlantic Anglophone world, a well-known educator. This book, published in 1823, shows that Muhlenberg will be a reformer indeed. While at St. James, Lancaster, Muhlenberg called the Episcopal Church to improve its public worship immediately. Better and more hymns were needed, and the poetry back of these hymns had better be quality. In this book, Muhlenberg had a complete psalter in line with his thinking and taste. He was appointed to the Hymnal Revision Committee by the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, and this group, which included Francis Scott Key, brought out a new hymnal in which the choices went from 57 to about 150, a very good improvement. This is perhaps Muhlenberg's most famous hymn that he wrote, which started out as a poem in 1825. You can get online through the parish website and read this whole hymn. I'm going to read the first stanza. It's very significant given the date of this utterance from Muhlenberg. He didn't like it later in life because he thought it was kind of somber, but I think it expresses very well something going on in his life when he was in Lancaster. I would not live alway is a quotation out of the book of Job. I would not live alway, I ask not to stay, where storm after storm rises dark o'er our way. The few lurid mornings that dawn on us here are enough for life woes, full enough for its cheer. Where the saints of all ages in harmony meet, their Savior and brethren transported to greet, while the anthems of rapture unceasingly roll, and the smile of the Lord is the feast of the soul. Midsummer 1826, Muhlenberg resigned this cure at St. James and sailed to Europe. While in Europe, he studied high-quality faith-based schools, especially investigating Pestalozzi's and von Wellenberg's happy and amazingly successful schools in Switzerland. He returned to America later that year as rector of St. George's Church, Flushing, Long Island, that's Queens County, not too far from Brooklyn. By 1828, he had founded what became the best school in America by 1835. It was called the Church Institute or the Flushing Institute. This is a rare photograph of the building that Muhlenberg painstakingly built, much of it at his own expense, to flesh out and implement his philosophy of education, which was highly developed by 1828 and became even more refined by 1836, when this Flushing Institute had developed into St. Paul's College and Grammar School. He was an amazingly successful educator, and I want to tell you that in 1870 there were only 500 secondary schools in the United States. And so Muhlenberg and his principal disciples became the go-to people for people looking to figure out how to educate boys and girls from the age of 13 up. Here's an aerial view of St. James School in St. James, Maryland, near Hagerstown, the second Muhlenberg-type church school. This is Henry Augustus Coit, who went to St. Paul's College and Grammar School and sat at the master's feet for several years. There's a plaque in St. James Church, Lancaster, I believe put up by alumni of St. Paul's School, Concord, New Hampshire. Henry Coit was the founding rector of St. Paul's in New Hampshire. He was at St. James in 1853 and 1854 as a classics teacher in Sam Bowman's parochial school. Muhlenberg produced Coit, and Coit loved and honored Muhlenberg ever after as the greatest educator he had ever known. I assume that the Lancaster Pauleys who put that plaque up think of Dr. Coit in the same exact way. Here's that marvelous Henry Vaughan Chapel at St. Paul's School, Concord, New Hampshire. Muhlenberg visited the Coit brothers at St. Paul's 2 or more times. He approved of St. Paul's and was delighted that the school was going to be well funded thanks to Dr. George Chain Shattuck. By 1856, when St. Paul's was founded, another disciple of Muhlenberg, Lloyd Breck, had founded schools in Wisconsin and Minnesota. Breck would take the model to California in 1868. Each new school built upon what was learned in the others. The successful scholastic concept was refined. Muhlenberg was the pioneer and his protégés were the perfecters in 6 states. James McLaughlin, the great historian of the American boarding school, recognized the greatness of Muhlenberg and the uniqueness of the schools. What was Muhlenberg's secret? It's hard to explain because it's so simple. If you would have an overall academic excellence in a school, you must aim above academic excellence toward a nobler target. That target is virtue or character understood in the Christian sense. I call it the high aim philosophy of education. In this method, character is the end of education. So it really is the education of the whole person to excellence. It's just the old principle of the longbow archer. This is the doctor in the late 1840s, artist unknown and exact date unknown. It is not later than 1850. And this is a very nice picture of Muhlenberg at this point in his life. What do you see in this face? I see success and assurance and confidence mixed with sadness and a little bit of disappointment. Muhlenberg had made a great success of the Flushing Institute and St. Paul's College and Grammar School. People were coming literally from all over the United States to go to school there. Things were going great. And then it came time to apply for a charter from the state of New York. About that time, the panic of 1837 hit. Financial markets collapsed. But more important than the depression that lasted for about 5 years, in my opinion, was the way that party politics in the Episcopal Church caused people to be suspicious of Muhlenberg because he sedulously avoided any party affiliation. Members of one party thought he was a secret card carrier in the other party. He was not able to raise the money he needed. And so what you see in this face is fairly serious disappointment also. I have a speech that Muhlenberg gave at St. James School in Maryland in 1850, and he is still bitter about the way he had Richard Upjohn design a building at College Point overlooking Long Island Sound. Beautiful pink and white marble foundations had gone in, the walls were going up, and it all came to a screeching halt. In any case, what had grown into St. Paul's College and Grammar School was belly up by 1845. At this time, Muhlenberg resolved to go into the city and live among the working poor for the rest of his life. This is the Church of the Holy Communion in Manhattan, which was founded by Muhlenberg in 1844 and erected in 1845. The Richard Upjohn building was paid for by Muhlenberg's little sister, Mary Muhlenberg Rogers. Her husband, John Rogers, died in 1841, and the church is a memorial to that good man who was the ever-generous churchman. This parish church was a new departure not only for Muhlenberg, but for the Episcopal Church as a whole, because what happened in this church and from this church really did change the Episcopal Church. From this headquarters in Manhattan, Dr. Muhlenberg continued to alter the course of the developing Episcopal Church. Let me list a few things that happened at the Church of the Holy Communion. The first and most interesting is that it was one of the first free churches in the United States. No one had to rent a pew. It was first come, first served. And then in this church, Muhlenberg blew the roof off of Episcopal worship by featuring every single Sunday a liturgical procession, a surpliced choir, Eucharist every Sunday, chanting of the Psalms, and a richer array of hymnody than any other church in New York City. Also, as in Lancaster, he set up a dispensary for the indigent, a soup kitchen, an insurance agency. He and Ann Ayres in 1844 established the Protestant Sisterhood of the Holy Communion, the first such organization since the Reformation. And this group of ladies, led by Ann Ayres, had incredible ministries they did all over New York. For example, beginning in 1847 on St. Luke's Day, Ann Ayres getting more and more involved in ministry to the sick and dying, persuaded Dr. Muhlenberg to begin to raise money on St. Luke's Day for this ministry among the sisters. This grew into St. Luke's Hospital by 1850, and it was chartered by the state of New York in 1858. It's now part of the Mount Sinai Morningside system. In 1853, from this parish, Muhlenberg wrote his famous memorial lamenting the divisions and strife among Christians, and he had a lot of personal experience with that. He called on all Christians to work toward reunion all over the world. In 1865, he helped Harriet Starr Cannon establish a cloistered sisterhood, the Community of St. Mary's, and you may have heard of the Sisters of St. Mary through their educational work. They had crackerjack girls' schools, first in Manhattan and then in Peekskill, New York, in Wisconsin, and in Tennessee. That was the Community of St. Mary. So this church was a place for lots of change that came out of Muhlenberg's head and heart. We Episcopalians tend to take it for granted that when we go into an Episcopal church in any part of the country, we're expecting it to be beautiful. This church that Muhlenberg built in 1844, 1845 was very new, however, and a little bit controversial for the richness of its interior, the appointments and furnishings and color. The model went all over the United States. Recently, I found a photograph, a beautiful interior of the Church of the Holy Communion in Charleston, which was based on this New York City parish church. After the Civil War, the rector there was the Reverend Toomer Porter. He was so concerned about all the orphaned boys that he created the Church of the Holy Communion School, and he brought in Bishop Gadsden's son, who had been educated by Muhlenberg, to be the principal academic person in the school, and it was very successful. Late in Porter's life, they changed the name of the school and honored the founder. That was Porter Military, which was a very good school academically. It's now Porter Goud School. But here you have proof of the influence of Muhlenberg even in the far south. This is a terrific photograph of St. Luke's Hospital. There was an atrium in this building behind those two towers, and the chapel, if I remember correctly, was on the second floor and opened up to the atrium. The purpose was to allow patients to hear daily morning prayer prayed and daily evensong sung. Isn't that wonderful? This is one of the houses Muhlenberg built at what he called St. John Land on Long Island. In 1866, or maybe a little before, Muhlenberg bought almost 500 acres not far from Smithtown, New York. He had a mile and a half of beachfront on the Sound. It was not really the doctor's foray into utopianism, as some people have said, since he was much too practical for that. All he wanted was for the working poor to get out of New York City into the country, where they would establish deep Christian community, breathe the pure air, and have the church at the center of their life. The land was gorgeous, the waterfront, orchards, meadows, and woods. It would be a Christian industrial community. That is, all residents would work side by side to produce in small groups the food, the clothing, built items, and so on. Education was a top priority for all ages, and again, Muhlenberg broke ground here because he had schools for adults. It was during these St. John Land years that William Muhlenberg began to say that the great study for all Christians is Jesus himself, what he did, what he said, how he lived his daily life. St. John Land was not particularly successful, but the land has been used for many socially beneficial initiatives, orphanages, communities for the mentally ill, and there is at least one nursing home on that property at the current time. It's called St. John Land. I can't imagine that Muhlenberg regrets any of these developments, though he would not like anything smacking of a secularizing tendency that does not look to Christ for all healing and human improvement. Muhlenberg's grave may be found today at St. John Land. In my dissertation research, I discovered that none had a more profound influence on the development of Muhlenberg's heart and mind than John Henry Newman. This portrait of Newman was done when he was elected Fellow of Oriel College, Oxford. He was also the vicar of the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin. His sermons were surprisingly a sensation. I say this because Newman had no pulpit histrionics to offer anyone. He just stood in the pulpit of St. Mary's and read his sermons. But people as diverse as Matthew Arnold and Walter Bagehot were enchanted by Newman's voice and what he had to say. Muhlenberg and his scholastic colleagues were likewise smitten by Newman's religious charm and his outlook when the sermons became available after 1831 in the United States. Newman, one of the leaders of the Oxford movement, which commenced in 1833, was a principal writer of the tracts for the Times. They came out in print in 1839. Muhlenberg and his protégés read those also. Muhlenberg liked Newman's sermons so much that he read them to his boys at Sunday afternoon vespers. Muhlenberg met Newman in person in Oxford in 1843. He wrote to a friend back in New York that Newman reminded him of Christ. This gives me shivers. Newman became a Roman Catholic in October 1845. Last year, 2019, he was formally canonized as a saint of the Roman Catholic Church. So the connection between Muhlenberg and Newman is worth exploring. Muhlenberg, of course, was shocked by the conversion, and according to his biographer, renounced Newman as a false prophet and a misleading sage. But it was too late to get rid of Newman. The two men had too much in common in terms of outlook, personality, reforming zeal, and especially total dedication to the person of Jesus Christ and to an uncompromising commitment to the ordained ministry of the church. Both men gave up everything to follow the Lord and be his faithful, energetic ministers in this often hurting, troubled, and confused world. Now, another thing they had in common is that it's very little known, but the truth of the matter is that John Henry Newman had a profound interest in education and essentially was a schoolmaster until he died. This information has been coming out thanks to Paul Shrimpton, who is a longtime scholar of Newman. Now let me say that I doubt Muhlenberg was ever tempted to convert to the Roman Church. For one thing, he knew he'd have to face Henry Melchior Muhlenberg when he got to heaven. But I submit that Muhlenberg certainly did feel a deep vocation, and it stood out in the Episcopal Church as a bit unconventional. I mean that he, like Newman, felt that the Anglican Church, as he knew it, was a bit of a straitjacket and needed improvement and betterment. They also believed, both men, that the Anglican Church was far too closely aligned with the powers of this world, and I think they had a point. Newman left, Muhlenberg stayed, but both expanded the horizons of their respective national churches. Each in his own way laid the foundation for a more commodious and complex and fulsome Anglican Christianity. I love this portrait of Dr. Muhlenberg. It is worthy of the man. Muhlenberg's religion is not easy to figure out. He would not identify with the Hobartian High Church or the Anglo-Catholics or the Ritualists. Yet members of each of these groups took Muhlenberg to be their religious inspiration. He was not a low churchman, neither was he a latitudinarian. He wanted to be very orthodox. If I were forced to place him, I'd say he ended up a Catholic-minded broad churchman. The incarnation was at the very center of his Christianity. But he was never light on the atonement. He admired the fiction of Charles Kingsley and the theology of F.D. Maurice, both leaders of the broad church movement. We can allow this man to have changed over his lifetime. All the rest of us do. In this country, he had a lot in common with the progressive Calvinist Henry Ward Beecher, but if you had called him a Beecherite, he probably would have denied it. Muhlenberg called himself an evangelical Catholic. Of course, he meant to surprise people with this apparent paradox. More than anything, it expresses a sentiment and not an intellectual puzzle. He might have said, why can't we be both and instead of either or all the time? In about 1850, he began publishing a weekly newspaper called The Evangelical Catholic. I think I am accurate when I take Muhlenberg's evangelical to mean the spontaneous, personal, even sentimental side of Christian faith. That subjective part of us that must be open to the listing of the Holy Spirit, that part of us that knows the Lord intuitively. By Catholic, he definitely meant that part of the faith that is solidly grounded on structures and not changing foundations. The Holy Scriptures as the Word of God written, the creeds, the historic liturgy, for Muhlenberg a dynamic thing, the sacramental grace that Christ promises. He had a Catholic view of the efficacy of the sacraments, but not without the believer's faith making the soul receptive to the Lord's grace. And the apostolic order of the historic church was important to him, as received by the Anglican Communion. William Augustus Muhlenberg, how can such a life be summed up in 30 minutes? St. James Church can be mighty proud of your co-rector back in the 1820s. Muhlenberg was utterly dedicated to Jesus Christ and to the vocation of the ordained priesthood. This dedication inspired so many women and men in his lifetime and after. He was one of the most effective and inspiring reformers the Episcopal Church has ever produced. He was the greatest secondary educator in American history, and I really believe that. He was a Christian with a social vision and an idea of how a republic should treat its people. He was not at all afraid to betray his class if it was morally right to do so. So he was a countercultural prophet in so many ways. He was a church entrepreneur, as Professor David Hine of the Marshall Foundation puts it. He was the father of ecumenism in the Episcopal Church, and he anticipated the liturgical movement. In his daily life, he never forgot the sick, the dying, the poor and needy, the disenfranchised and the forgotten people of this world. Ecclesia Plantanda, the motto of William Muhlenberg's great-grandfather. The church must be planted. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.